So, Season 5 is here. We already covered the content that came along with this update as of today. If you missed that, check out the last video here from a few hours ago on the channel. But in this video, I want to take a look at the weapon tuning that we ended up getting with this seasonal update, as a lot of weapons were adjusted, but realistically, how much of a wrench did Raven throw into the meta? That's what we're going to be examining here and breaking down for us. As we go along, drop your thoughts down below. Are you liking the new season so far? Are you enjoying the weapon changes? Is there any weapon tuning that stands out to you in particular? Whatever the case, drop your thoughts below. But if you enjoyed the video, you find it at all insightful, do me a favor and drop a like on it. And if you're new to the channel and you'd like to stay up to date with all things Warzone Season 5, Modern Warfare 2 upcoming, and anything Call of Duty related, hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you in the community. Additionally, with the start of Season 5 here, if you'd like to support the channel a little bit further and plan on picking up either the Battle Pass for Season 5 or any of the new operators or bundles that come along in the shop, using creator code Espresso in the in-game store is a great way to do so. But of course, it's entirely optional. Do not ever feel pressured to, but if you do, tweet me a picture. I'd love to shout out to your generous support in upcoming videos. And finally, before we jump into the weapon tuning, we'll be live grinding out all the new weapons here, ranking those up, checking them out within the Warzone meta, and figuring out the best weapons that you should be using here live over on my Twitch channel all day and night. So if you guys would like to come hang out and check out the stream, that link is down there in the description below. We'd love to have you swing by the stream and tell me how you're doing. But anyways, let's take a look at the adjusted Warzone meta. So let's start out with some generalities, some top-down level things, because they started with some things that are more so blanket rather than weapon-specific tuning. For example, the Vanguard Marksman rifles now have assault rifle ammunition used as opposed to the sniper rounds. There was a bunch of changes to the variable scopes from 3 to 6 times and 4 to 8 times that have been adjusted significantly. Those two in particular now having sniper glint on them, whereas they did not beforehand. There was some balancing for the EX1, as we talked about in the content update video earlier in the day. That ends up having a finite amount of ammo, rather than in traditional multiplayer in Vanguard. There really was no ammo cap. You'd still have to reload after 60 air quote rounds, but you'd have an infinite number of charges essentially to work with that. But talking about weapons in particular, let's start out with the assault rifle category. The AS-44 was something that was targeted initially because it was kind of encroaching on the submachine gun class, as they put it. They wanted to bring it more in line with assault rifles, so we saw a max damage decrease to 22, which is down from 24, but then buffs to the Kovalevskaya 615mm barrel, increasing the damage range to 30 rather than a 20% bonus, and increasing that vertical recoil control ever so slightly. The 12B custom ended up getting a movement speed penalty decrease, but initial firing recoil increase, so a buff and a nerf to that attachment as well. The bar saw a buff to the 8mm Klauser 40 round magazine. That now has 50 rounds instead of 40, so not entirely sure the thought process behind that one. I wouldn't say the bar is top tier anymore, but I mean, that was definitely an attachment that made the weapon very viable and very usable, so adding 10 more rounds might shake it up a little bit in terms of the power rankings. The Cooper Carbine ended up having the compressed rounds and the 22-inch Cooper Custom nerfed ever so slightly, with recoil control penalties increased and horizontal recoil control decreased respectively. The KGM-40 had a handful of adjustments here, all of which are nerfs, unfortunately, trying to take this thing seemingly from the best weapon down to maybe not so best. Not necessarily mid-tier, but still pretty usable, just not as dominant. We saw the minimum damage decrease to 23, down from 25. The sprint to fire time was increased to 1.02, which was up from the base of 1. The Rise Dwarf 720mm barrel ended up having its muzzle velocity decreased, recoil control decreased, and horizontal recoil control decreased, while the ammunition of the 6.5mm and 8mm Klauser rounds saw penalties to the muzzle velocity, vertical recoil control, horizontal recoil control, movement speed scalar values, as well as the ADS time penalty, and the VDD padded stock had its recoil control decreased down to 12.5, whereas previously it was 14%. Now, here's where we start to get into some interesting buffs for assault rifles. The Growl was depicted in our pre-briefing with Ted Timmons from Raven yesterday on a call that we sat down with. He stated in particular, Growl is king. And, well, if you look at this, we had the max damage increased to 29, up from 28, a max damage range increase to 31.5 meters, which is about a meter increase, and a neck damage multiplier increase to 1.15, which is up from 1.01, a substantial buff on that value in particular. So if you're an accurate shot, the Growl actually might be a pretty viable weapon once again here. And for me, as somebody that loved the Growl, I'm excited to jump in and try this out. But we also saw the Groza had its min damage increase to 24, which is up from 23. The Vargo 52 had its ADS transition in and out time decreased, making that a little bit faster, and the ADS time penalty decreased on the Spetsnaz 60 round magazine. Now the Vargo S in Vanguard had its minimum damage increased to 22, up from 20, while the neck damage multiplier was increased to 1.5, which is up from 1.3. Again, another substantial neck damage increase there. Across the board, we saw a handful of different attachments adjusted but buffed for the Vargo S, making, again, it may be a contender. I still don't know if I'd put this in the the top 10 just yet, but it might be a little bit more viable now here after that. The STG-44 had its 760mm barrel decreased in its horizontal recoil control as well as its muzzle velocity, while the 8mm Kerr's 60-round magazine, though, did have a slight buff in the ADS time scaler, so making it a little bit faster. As for the LMGs, the UGM had its sustained recoil slightly adjusted. Nothing really detailed specifically on that, so we'll have to dive deeper into that to note for sure. The Type 11 saw its shrouded barrel cut back on that rate of fire penalty, and the horizontal recoil control was increased, while the 45-round magazine saw the muzzle velocity penalty removed entirely. On the Marksman category overall, we saw the flinch decreased on Marksman rifles by 33%, and again, now using assault rifle ammunition. The SVT-40 had a handful of adjustments to a couple of attachments that were both increasing and decreasing the properties of the weapon, but the time to ADS was decreased overall, so I still wouldn't say this is a viable weapon, but if you like to play around with non-meta or just strange loadouts, you might notice a difference here in that ADS speed. The M1 Garand saw its muzzle velocity increased with a couple of attachments as well to the magazines adjusted, increasing capacity across the board, but also still having some nerfs to, say, like the 20-round magazine had its rate of fire bonus decreased, as well as movement speed and recoil control decreased. So a couple of things across the board there. The G43 had its max damage increased to the 35, up from 34, while its min damage was increased to 31, up from 28. So that minimum damage is definitely going to be a little bit more powerful, but again, you might not see as many G43s, though across the board for a couple of the barrels, you did see some buffs there as well. The M1916 saw its time to ADS decreased, while the custom barrel had its recoil recovery adjusted, and the Sakura 20-round magazine unfortunately decreased in that rate of fire bonus. The Modern Warfare crossbow saw its lower torso damage multiplier and upper and lower extremity damage multipliers decreased. That probably compensating for the explosive rounds. I know that a bunch of people were using the explosive tip Modern Warfare crossbow, and it was a one-hit down guaranteed in a lot of the modes, so that might be to mitigate that a little bit. The melees saw the combat shield movement speed scaler decreased. The scythe had a melee damage increase to 150, up from 145, while its speed was increased by 20, and the attack interrupt time was decreased ever so slightly. The dual Kodachis ended up having its standing and crouching melee range decreased. The prone melee range was also decreased, but the standing and crouching charged melee was increased to 2.4 meters, up from 1.7. Now, the Klauser handgun from Vanguard had a bunch of buffs to the Wyvern and the Fitzbert barrels, plus the 45 ACP 12-round magazine, adjusting things like your damage range, horizontal and vertical recoil, movement speed, muzzle velocity, and other things like that. The ACP rounds had its magazine capacity also increased to 16, up from 12. So a lot of ammunition adjustments here in this update, though still probably the one that, since Modern Warfare, people have wanted to see adjustments to the magazine capacity. The SCAR, that still has, after 2.5 years, not been adjusted at all, unfortunately. The sniper rifles, we saw the flinch overall decreased on heavy snipers by 11% and flinch on the light snipers by 40%. So things like your Kar 98K versus your HDR and ZRG. The LW3 Tundra had its damage range increased, upper torso damage and lower torso damage multiplier increased, while extremity damage multipliers were increased, and that ADS transition in time was decreased, making that again ever so slightly. The Type 99 had its Sarashi sniper barrel increased in the neck damage multiplier, while sprint to fire penalty was also decreased, but on a slight nerf, the upper torso damage multiplier was decreased. Now, the 3-line sniper rifle had the 30-06 20-round magazines. That got a damage bonus decrease, and kind of saw that one coming. It was something that was busted in titanium trials for a little bit, and definitely was one of the more prevailing builds, becoming the sort of sniper meta across the board, even outside of titanium trials. But the rate of fire penalty was also then decreased, so a little bit of a buff and a nerf there. Shotguns, we ended up seeing that the combat shotgun ended up having adjustments to the 12-gauge 5-round tube mag and the sawed-off, while also the headshot and neck locational damage multipliers were decreased. Now, the submachine gun category, to sort of cap us off here, had a lot of weapons adjusted, and a lot of them were nerfs. The Armaguerra was one that was probably hit one of the heaviest in terms of when you look at the amount of things adjusted, every single thing's red. It was definitely an attempt here by Raven to cut down on the use of this weapon. We firstly saw the ADS movement speed scale decreased across the board, but then we saw the 550mm, the 180mm, and the 570mm barrels all nerfed, having adjustments to the vertical recoil control, horizontal recoil control, headshot damage multiplier, and muzzle velocity all decreased. Now, the magazines of the 72-round mags and the 60-round mags saw nerfs as well to the muzzle velocity, damage range, movement speed, and ADS time penalty, while the skeletal stock ended up having its initial recoil decreased, while the sustained recoil penalty that was increased to make it a little harder. The Marco saw a handful of nerfs as well, with a max and and mid damage decrease, but a mid damage range increase by 5 meters. So that might balance out, but for right now on paper, it still looks like a little bit of a nerf. Then the 342mm and 355mm barrels saw muzzle velocity, recoil control, and vertical and horizontal recoil control all decreased. Now the Blixen interestingly had the 17-inch barrel recoil control decreased, but the Gorenko 54-round magazine had the headshot multiplier removed entirely, which is interesting, but upper torso damage multiplier increased to 1.13, which was up from base of 1, and the ADS time scaler penalty decreased. So you got a little bit more out of those factors, but also removing the headshot multiplier altogether. Be interesting to see how this one plays out in a live environment. The UGR had the magazine capacity increased to 45, while the explosive rounds ended up getting an increase to 50 rounds, up from 36. The Fennec from Modern Warfare had a neck damage multiplier increase to 1.4, up from 1.01. A massive buff to that one, while the leg and feet damage multipliers were increased to 1, which was up from 0.9. So the Fennec, you're still going to burn through ammo, but if you're in close quarters, it might not be a bad option here going forward. Now, the M1928 had a handful of buffs and nerfs, with the 2.5 and the 5.5-inch barrels being adjusted, while the 8mm rounds were adjusted in the recoil control, decreasing the vertical penalty on that, but the damage range was also decreased, respectively, to both of those. The PPSH saw a handful of adjustments to attachments, like the 300mm barrel. That hip-fire accuracy penalty was decreased, as was the damage range being increased. So buffs to that, while the 8mm Nambu 71-round magazines had the damage penalty removed, but the damage range penalty was increased by 5%. The folding stock had the recoil recovery increased as well, so a slight buff there as well. The P90 had a mid damage increase to 22, while the min damage was increased to 19, up from 18, though the mid damage range was slightly decreased. And finally, the Striker 45 saw the neck damage multiplier increase, while the upper torso damage multiplier was increased as well. So nerfs and buffs to weapons that you might not have expected, and a couple of weapons that really came out of this definitely has some solid contenders, and ones you might not necessarily consider all that much. The Grau coming back potentially, the Fennec having an interesting adjustment that might make it something in close quarters, the Blixen, Marco, and Armaguerra all having some adjustments that might knock it down a peg. We'll see how this all comes to a head with the meta weapons that we'll talk about tomorrow or Friday, depending on when we can get that up. But that is the weapon tuning that we saw here out of the Season 5 update. I would love to get your thoughts and feedback down there in the comment section down below. Is there anything in particular that really stands out to you out of this weapon tuning? Anything that you guys are really excited for? Whatever the case, drop your thoughts down below. But if you guys enjoyed the video, you found it at all insightful, do me a favor and drop a like on the video. And if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing regarding all things Modern Warfare 2, Warzone Season 5, and anything COD related. We'll keep you up to date with everything. So that said, thanks so much for watching. My name is Espresso. I'll see you guys later. Take care and peace.